The paperwork. Viktor Lofa awoke to the sound of his doorbell ringing. It was far too early for any visitors, and with a groggy sigh he rolled out of bed and shuffled to the door. Through the peephole he saw no one. When he opened the door, however, there was something waiting for him on the doormat. A large, nondescript envelope with no return address. Viktor squinted at it, as though it might vanish if he blinked too hard. The name was his, but the label wasn't printed. Instead, it was handwritten in a sharp, elaborate, almost calligraphic style. Curious, he ripped it open. Inside was a stack of papers as thick as a novel. Each page seemed more important and formidable than the last. Certificates, forms, notices. Some were official-looking, stamped and embossed with various seals. There were declarations of administrative errors, demands for signatures, and statements of intent that were impossible to understand. The first few pages requested that Viktor, within 10 business days, provide proof of his existence to the Central Office of Records. Proof of his existence? What were they talking about? He'd lived in the same apartment for 5 years. He had a job, a modest one to be sure, but a job nonetheless. He had friends, neighbors, and a history that stretched back to childhood, however unremarkable it may have been. It was all very well documented. Proof of my existence indeed, Viktor scoffed, and tossed the papers onto his kitchen table. He went about his day, hoping that the envelope had been delivered by mistake, or as some kind of joke. But as the hours passed, the contents of that thick stack of papers began to haunt him. What if it wasn't a mistake or a joke? Ignoring those documents could have serious consequences. Still, it seemed crazy to ask him to prove his existence. His girlfriend, Eva, arrived later that evening for dinner. She noticed the papers piled beside the table and flipped through a few pages. "What's all this?" she asked. "Some bizarre mix-up at the Central Office of Records. They're asking me to prove I exist," Viktor laughed, though his unease was growing. Eva gave a weak smile, her eyes glazing over as she skimmed the documents. "Bureaucracies, huh? Always something ridiculous." Her tone was light, but she seemed distracted, as though the strangeness of the situation didn't fully register. Nevertheless, Viktor could appreciate the irony of his dilemma. He had always been self-effacing. Eva often teased him about it. The invisible man, she would call him. Admittedly, it was true. He preferred not to be noticed, especially at work. It was safer. Years ago he had read the Japanese proverb, "The nail that sticks out gets hammered down." He had never wanted to be that nail. Viktor chuckled nervously to himself. Considering the circumstances, he mused, perhaps he had kept too low a profile. The next morning, Viktor decided to handle the problem directly and headed to the Central Office of Records, the imposing gray building where all civic matters were dealt with. The bulky envelope weighed heavily in his coat pocket, and his heart pounded with a mixture of anger and concern. How could anyone demand that he prove his existence? What a stupid waste of time, he thought as he stepped inside. The receptionist at the front desk was a tired-looking woman with round glasses that pinched her nose. "I received this yesterday," Viktor said, placing the envelope on the counter. The woman glanced at the papers inside, but made no move to touch them. "Room 27B down the hall," she said indifferently. "Couldn't we clear this up here?" Viktor asked nervously. "I think there's been a mistake. I've lived here for years." "Room 27B, she repeated firmly, pointing the way, and then turned her attention to the next person in line. Following her directions, Viktor descended a steep flight of stairs that seemed to twist down deeper than the building's outside appearance suggested. The farther he went, the darker and colder it became, until the final turn revealed a long, dim hallway. The fluorescent lights above flickered weakly, casting long shadows that distorted the corridor's already unsettling narrowness. At the end of the hallway, a small brass plate marked 27B gleamed faintly. Viktor hesitated, but with a deep breath pushed open the door. Inside, the room was cluttered with stacks of dusty files, scattered papers, and a single desk illuminated by a sickly yellow lamp. Behind the desk sat an odd little man, his posture hunched as though he had spent his entire life folding inward on himself. His thin, pointed face was framed by greasy, slicked-back hair, and his large black eyes, behind thick spectacles, were fixed upon his work. He didn't look up when Viktor entered. "Excuse me," Viktor began, trying to keep his voice steady. "My name is Viktor Lova. I received these papers yesterday. Obviously, there's been some sort of mistake." The man looked up and smiled, revealing yellow teeth that seemed uncommonly sharp. "A mistake? No, Mr. Lova. There are no mistakes here. Everything is carefully documented, meticulously verified. Let's see." The man took the envelope and shuffled through the papers. "Ah, yes, the verification of existence forms. It seems, Mr. Lova, that there is some ambiguity regarding your place in the records. It happens from time to time. Nothing to be alarmed about." "Ambiguity?" Viktor repeated, frowning. "What possible ambiguity could there be? I've lived here my whole life. It's absurd." The man raised an eyebrow, as if amused by Viktor's indignation. "Absurd, is it? You'd be surprised how often people make that claim." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "But claims are one thing, Mr. Lova. Proof is another." Viktor stared, confused. "So you're actually serious? You want me to prove that I exist?" "Precisely," the bureaucrat said with a slow nod. "These documents outline the necessary steps. You'll need to gather all the required forms of identification: witnesses, signatures, birth certificate, tax records, employment verification, and residency proof." Then the man paused as if considering his next words carefully. "But it's more than that, Mr. Lova." He leaned forward, the yellow lamp casting eerie shadows across his gaunt face. "The question is not just whether you exist, but whether you should exist." Viktor blinked. "I beg your pardon? What does that even mean?" The bureaucrat's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with some secret pleasure. "The records are very particular. If you examine them closely, you will find that they account not only for existence, but for purpose and necessity as well. You see, Mr. Lova, there are those who exist, but without reason, without consequence. They are the gray smudges on the documents of life, easily erased." Viktor's throat tightened. "What are you saying? That I could somehow be erased with just the stroke of a pen? Nonsense. I have a job. I have friends and family. I'm a person. I exist. I matter." The man attempted to laugh, but produced only a dry, rattling sound. "Matter? Ah, yes, that's the tricky part, isn't it?" He stood coming around the desk with slow, deliberate steps. "So many go through life without leaving a trace, Mr. Lova. One wonders if they were ever really here at all." Shocked, Viktor took a step back. This strange man's words and manner, his very presence, began to terrify him. "I don't understand," he said, his voice trembling now. "This is insane." The bureaucrat's large eyes gleamed even more brightly. "Insane? No, Mr. Lova, it's quite sane, quite straightforward. The fact remains that there is a question about your existence, and you must not only document your existence, you must justify it. You must show in no uncertain terms that your being here has meaning, significance. Otherwise—" Viktor shuddered. "Otherwise what?" The man's smile suddenly vanished, replaced by an expression so inhuman, so alien, that Viktor felt his blood turn to ice. "Otherwise, Mr. Lova, your file will be closed permanently." Viktor's breath caught in his throat. He looked around the dim, oppressive room, suddenly feeling as though the walls themselves were watching him, waiting. "But this is wrong," he whispered. "I know who I am. I'm Viktor Lova. I'm standing right here. I exist. I know I exist." The bureaucrat stepped closer, his voice lowering to an ominous murmur. "Prove it, Mr. Lova. Prove it." The man returned to his desk, sat down, and resumed his work. "You have 9 days left, Mr. Lova," he said without looking up. "I suggest you use them wisely." For a long moment, Viktor stood there, frozen, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. Then he turned, his legs feeling weak, and stumbled out of the room. The hallway felt even longer now, darker, the flickering lights almost winking out entirely as he hurried back up the stairs, his mind reeling. By the time Viktor burst through the doors of the central office, the fresh air outside did little to calm his terror. He kept walking as fast as he could, his feet carrying him away from the building, from that horrible room, and from the hideous little man whose words echoed in his mind. "Prove it." The following morning, when Viktor awoke, he lay in bed for a few minutes, simply staring at the ceiling. He didn't immediately recall his encounter at the Central Office of Records, but when he finally did, he laughed out loud, convinced that it had been just a terrible, elaborate nightmare. Then he went to the kitchen to make his coffee and spotted the envelope lying on the table, and it all came back to him. It hadn't been a dream or some hallucination. It was all very real. The paperwork, the conversation with that grotesque man. And as he relived the experience, he was once again flooded by fear and confusion. Almost immediately, however, those emotions were replaced by anger and determination. If that bureaucrat wanted proof of his existence, he would give it to him. Irrefutable proof. Viktor was also angry with himself. How could he have been so gullible as to believe for even an instant that his very existence could be erased? Well, now he would act, and act quickly. He would set the record straight and move on with his life. So for the next few days, Viktor plunged head first into a frantic effort to assemble the documentation demanded of him. At first he tried the obvious, his birth certificate, school records, employment history, but these things proved maddeningly elusive. The birth certificate had been lost years ago, and while the archives promised to look into the matter, they never called back. His school claimed they had no record of a Viktor Lova ever attending. His employer, too, couldn't seem to locate his personnel file, insisting he must have confused them with some other company. Even his tax filings, when he attempted to retrieve copies from the government's database, came back with a chilling message. No records found. His landlord, Mr. Corin, seemed puzzled when Viktor asked for a copy of his lease. "Mr. Corin, you've known me for years," Viktor insisted. "I've paid rent every month like clockwork." Corin furrowed his brow and stared at Viktor as though seeing him for the first time. "Sorry, I guess my memory isn't what it used to be. I'll check my files and get back to you." Then he shrugged and walked away. As his search deepened, Viktor began to feel genuine panic. Every step in this process felt like grasping at smoke, as if the life he had always taken for granted was evaporating before his eyes. With every missing document, every dead end, it became harder to shake the insidious thought the bureaucrat had planted in his mind. Did I ever exist? I mean, really exist? It seemed preposterous, yet the doubts gnawed at him. He had memories, of course, detailed, vivid memories, but were they enough? Could they alone prove his existence to anyone else, let alone justify it? As Viktor's frustration grew, so did a strange distance between him and Eva. She came by less frequently, her excuses vague and evasive. When they did see each other, her warmth seemed to fade a little more each time, as if the very act of being near him had somehow become a burden. One evening she sat across from him in his small kitchen, absently stirring her coffee. "Eva, you've been very aloof lately," Viktor said, forcing a smile. "It's this paperwork mess, isn't it?" Eva frowned, as if she hadn't heard him. What paperwork? The documents from the central office, the ones that say I have to prove I exist. She looked at him blank-faced, as though trying to recall some faraway memory. You mentioned something about that before, but I don't really remember. Viktor stared at her, stunned. You don't remember? You looked at the papers yourself. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her gaze skittering away from his. It's probably just a mistake, Viktor. You worry too much. Over the next few days, Eva's visits stopped altogether. When he tried to call her, the phone rang endlessly. Then one day her number was disconnected. Friends began to slip away from him, but not in the usual, gradual way that people lose touch. When Viktor called his best friend Alex, the conversation took a frightening turn. It was as if Alex could no longer place who Viktor was, his memories of him dissolving into nothingness. Alex, it's Viktor. We've known each other since university. We were talking just last week. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Viktor. I'm sorry, I don't know anyone by that name. You don't know me? How can you not know me? Viktor said in disbelief. I think you've got the wrong number, Alex said, the call ending with a sharp click. His other friends responded similarly, as though some invisible force had whispered his non-existence into their ears. Viktor even attempted to reach out to his parents, but they claimed not to have heard from him in years when, in fact, he had spoken with them only weeks before. Each step of the way, the walls closed in tighter. As Viktor's world unraveled, the paperwork continued to haunt him. The days and hours blurred together as Viktor's presence in the world grew fainter. The clerk in room 27B, whom Viktor now visited daily, was implacable. Mr. Lova, the clerk began, I trust you're not here for yet another repetition of our previous conversations. The matter is clear. Without the proper documentation, you do not exist. It's a simple administrative fact. But I'm standing right in front of you, Viktor protested. Please be reasonable. How can I not exist? Viktor leaned forward, his voice tight with desperation. I've tried. I've brought everything I have, every scrap of paper I could find, but none of it is enough. What could I possibly do or say to justify my existence to you? What do you expect from me? The bureaucrat's thin lips curved slightly into a small, almost imperceptible smile. A smile that held no warmth. The question is not what I expect, Mr. Lova. The question is, what do you expect from yourself? Viktor simply stared at the man, unsure if he had heard correctly. The bureaucrat slowly removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a cloth that seemed too pristine for the dingy office. You see, Mr. Lova, justification is not merely a matter of records and signatures. He set the spectacles back on his nose and leaned in slightly, his smile widening. It's about your worth, your value. Viktor swallowed hard, his throat dry. But I don't know how to answer that. What do you want me to say? The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. Please understand, Mr. Lova, my task is not to assess worth, but simply to record it. Then his smile tightened, and his gaze became even more penetrating. Ask yourself, what have you done to deserve your place here? What difference have you made? Have you changed the lives of others? Do you imagine the world would be a poorer place without you? Or perhaps, Mr. Lova, he let the words hang in the air, his voice growing soft, almost caressing, you have simply drifted, without impact, without effect, merely occupying space. Viktor felt a cold dread creeping through him. His mind raced, scrambling for something, some accomplishment, some meaning that would justify him. But every thought seemed hollow, insignificant. But what if I don't have anything like that? The bureaucrat's expression never wavered. Then, Mr. Lova, he said softly, you must accept the inevitable. He reached into a drawer, pulled out yet another blank form, and slid it across the desk. "Here, perhaps this will assist you. It's a template, a guide, if you will, for identifying your contributions. Fill it out and return it. We will then see if there is anything of consequence to be recorded." Desperation now crept into Viktor's every move. He spent his nights poring over scraps of evidence, old photos, letters, anything to convince himself that he was real, that he mattered. But the more he looked, the less substantial everything seemed. His achievements, his connections, his contributions, what did they amount to? One night, sitting alone in his darkened apartment, Viktor found himself staring at the bare wall. His mind cycled obsessively through the same thoughts: his job, his girlfriend, his friends, and his family, everything that supposedly made him him. Yet as he reviewed each facet of his life, a horrible realization sank in. His work at the office had been mundane, inconsequential. He processed documents, information he barely understood, for people he would never meet. Did it matter if he had done it or someone else had? Would anyone notice the difference? He existed, yes, but in some strange liminal space where his presence was both there and not there, acknowledged and yet ignored. Perhaps he really was one of those gray smudges, an error in the grand scheme of things, just waiting to be erased. And then one day, Viktor looked at his faint reflection in the mirror, and for a fleeting moment a frightening thought seized him. Perhaps that grotesque little man was right. Perhaps he had never really existed at all. At the end of the week, when Viktor returned to the Central Office of Records, the bureaucrat was sitting behind his desk, as always, motionless, the same secret smile tugging at his lips. His desk lamp cast a sickly glow over his pallid skin, making him look more like a figure of wax rather than flesh. He slowly raised his head, his dark eyes glittering with something like amusement. "Mr. Lova," he said pleasantly, his voice dripping with mock politeness, "I take it you've returned to present your findings. I trust you've come prepared this time." Without a word, Viktor slumped into the chair across from him, the form he had been given still clutched in his hand. It was crumpled now, worn from his grip, and it was still blank. Viktor swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and shook his head. I have nothing." "I couldn't find the proof," Viktor said, barely able to meet the man's eyes. "But I still exist. I'm here." The bureaucrat's smile widened, revealing those sharp, unnerving teeth once more. He leaned forward slightly, like a predator intently watching its prey and waiting to pounce. "Nothing, Mr. Lova? No evidence? No documentation? Not even the faintest trace of justification for your existence?" When Viktor finally answered, his voice was barely audible. "I tried. I searched everywhere. I looked at my whole life, every decision, every action. But—" His hands trembled, the crumpled papers slipping from his grasp onto the desk. "There's nothing. I haven't done anything that really matters. I guess I don't have any justification." The silence that followed was crushing. The bureaucrat tilted his head slightly, studying Viktor with a detached sort of curiosity, as though the confession amused him. "You disappoint me, Mr. Lova," he sighed. "I had great hopes for you. Unfortunately, those hopes were misplaced. So," he continued, his voice silky smooth, "after all this time, all these attempts, you've come to the conclusion that your existence has been utterly meaningless?" Viktor stared down at his hands, feeling a deep, numbing despair settle into his bones. "I suppose, yes." The bureaucrat's smile now twisted into something darker, a near sadistic glee flashing behind his eyes. "And you've accepted this, have you? That you are, in essence, a void, a man who simply occupied space, consumed resources, but ultimately contributed nothing of consequence? Viktor flinched but didn't argue. He had no fight left. "Yes," he murmured, "I accept it. I have to accept it." For a long moment the bureaucrat simply watched him, his fingers tapping idly on the desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was colder, sharper. "Then there's nothing more to be done, is there?" Viktor's heart sank. "What happens now?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The bureaucrat sat back in his chair, his smile fading into something far more unsettling, a look of utter indifference. "Now, Mr. Lova, you are erased. You will be forgotten. A vacant space where once there was something, however trivial." He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a large red stamp, and pressed it firmly onto the blank form Viktor had left behind. The sound echoed in the quiet room, final and irrevocable. The bureaucrat met Viktor's eyes one last time, his voice now devoid of any emotion. "Your file is now closed. You will no longer be remembered. No history, no legacy, just nothing." Viktor sat there, numb, staring at the stamped form. The bureaucrat stood and opened the office door. "Goodbye, Mr. Lova, or rather, farewell." Viktor stood on unsteady legs, feeling a strange weightlessness overtake him. As he walked toward the door, he glanced back one last time, but the bureaucrat had already returned to his paperwork, as if Viktor had never been there at all. In a daze, Viktor stepped out of the central office of records and walked slowly back to his apartment. He fished his key from his pocket and slipped it into the lock, but it didn't turn. His hands trembled as he tried again, but the key seemed to be for another door entirely. He knocked, his heart pounding. At first there was no answer. Panic surged through him, and he began banging on the door with his fists. Finally the door opened, but instead of the familiar sight of his apartment, a stranger stood before him. The man was tall, with a look of mild irritation on his face. "Can I help you?" the stranger asked, eyeing Viktor warily. Viktor blinked in disbelief. "This is my apartment. I live here," he stammered. The man raised an eyebrow. "I've been living here for years," he said flatly. "I don't know who you are, but you've got the wrong place." No, this is my home," Viktor insisted, terrified. "I'm Viktor Lova. I've lived here for 5 years. I pay rent to Mr. Koren." The man's expression grew colder. "Listen, pal, I've never heard of any Viktor Lova. I already told you I've been here for years. This is my place. I think you should leave." Viktor stood frozen in the hallway, his pulse racing. He glanced past the man into what should have been his apartment, but nothing was familiar. The furniture, the colors, even the layout seemed to have shifted into something alien. "This can't be happening," Viktor whispered. He felt like a ghost, less substantial than a shadow. The stranger's gaze hardened. "You'd better go," he said, shutting the door firmly in Viktor's face. Viktor stood there astonished. His own key was useless, his home occupied by someone else, and no one could remember who he was. It wasn't just that they had forgotten him. It was as if he had never even lived. Viktor walked the streets that night, feeling his form grow lighter with each step. People passed him by without a glance. His reflection in shop windows became faint, as if he were a mere trick of the light. He kept walking until he reached a cafe he used to visit, long before he met Eva. When he entered, the place was busy, but he saw that his old table was available. As he walked over to it, nobody noticed him, even several people he recognized. He could feel their eyes simply sliding over him. He sat down and looked around the room. Everyone was happy and animated, talking and laughing. He envied them. He could no longer even imagine what that felt like, being happy. Then he spotted Amy. She was still working there. Amy always served him whenever he went to that cafe. Watching her move from table to table, smiling and joking with customers, Viktor recalled the warmth of their many conversations, as well as his occasional timid attempts at flirtation. He had been very attracted to her, but could never quite work up the courage to ask her out. That was so like him, he reflected bitterly. Don't take chances. Don't risk anything. He realized now what a small, frightened life he had lived, a lukewarm life. He stared at the floor, lost in thought. Then he heard someone talking to him and looked up. It was Amy. "Good evening," she said brightly. He felt a flicker of hope. She could see him. "Hello, Amy. How have you been?" She looked into his eyes, obviously trying to place him. "I've come here before," he added quickly. "Quite often, actually." Viktor searched her face for some hint of recognition. He found none. "As you can imagine," she smiled, looking closely at him, "I talk to a lot of customers, but I'm usually very good with names and faces." She shook her head and laughed. "Well, maybe it'll come to me. In the meantime, what can I get for you?" Dejected, Viktor took a few moments to respond. "Just a coffee, I guess," he finally replied. "Coming right up," she said cheerfully. Then, noticing his pained expression, she asked, "Are you okay?" He smiled weakly. "I've been better." "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and then added reassuringly, "Well, I'm sure your evening will improve." As Viktor watched her walk back to the counter to pour his coffee, a wave of desperation washed over him. She was his last chance. If only he could make her recognize him, realize who he was, maybe he could take his life back, reclaim his existence. When she returned and put his coffee down, he quickly grabbed her hand. "Please, Amy, try to remember," he pleaded. "You know me. I'm Viktor. My name is Viktor Lova. We've talked many times." She stared at him, and he could see her struggling, doing her best to retrieve some trace of him. Then she gently pulled her hand away. "I'm very sorry, sir, but I'm drawing a blank. I wish I could help you." Then she turned and started back toward the counter. Suddenly, Viktor felt even lighter. He looked down at his hands. Once solid, they now shimmered and glistened, as if his skin were made of vapor. He held them up to his face. He could see through them, could see Amy walking away from him. Horrified, he opened his mouth to cry out to her. "Hey, Amy," her manager shouted. "Who's the coffee for?" She stopped and looked back. "That's funny," she replied, staring at the steaming cup on the empty table. "I don't remember." 1 month later, an annoyed Frank Roberts stepped into the central office of records. He had never visited the building before and resented having to be there. Marching directly to the front desk, he angrily tossed a thick envelope onto the counter. "What exactly is the meaning of this nonsense?" he demanded. A tired-looking woman with round glasses that pinched her nose glanced at the papers inside and then handed the envelope back to the scowling man. "Room 27B, she said with a peculiar smile, and pointed the way. That was The Paperwork, one of my own short stories. I hope you enjoyed it. And just a parting word of advice. Should you find an envelope waiting for you one day, addressed in a precise hand and stamped with unquestionable authority, you may wish to read the contents carefully. I'm James DeNoss, and as always, thank you for listening.